Self-confidence seems like something very internal, something between you and yourself. So I wonder, why do we put so much value upon looking confident? I guess we can't really escape that, since if we want to move up in life, whatever that means, we need to appear confident, for other people to put trust in us in a way that we seemingly trust ourselves. Is the performance of self-confidence really needed then? Is inner self-confidence not enough? All definitions of confidence I came across focus on assurance, certainty. Of course, there's always the confidence in another person, but what I'm focusing on here is the confidence in yourself. So the way I read it is that self-confidence is 1, knowing yourself, and 2, trusting yourself. And that way it seems like it's about there not being any surprises within yourself. Since you know and trust yourself, then you know how you'll react to things. You know your strengths and your weaknesses, and you know how to direct yourself through life while predicting what may happen. Obviously, you can't predict everything. In fact, you can predict very little. But you can predict yourself, at least. As always, I'm up for redefining terms, and that comes for self-confidence too. And after reflecting on this for some time, I decided that maybe being self-confident is not about having an optimistic self-view, which is how confidence is usually marketed. Rather, it's about looking at yourself realistically. Maybe the reason why we may not seem confident in public is because of our inner confidence, which can't help but make us aware of our weaknesses, which in turn makes us more self-aware when we're in public. That seems a bit counterintuitive, but it's an interesting perspective. It's as if your self-confidence makes us seem less confident. Does that make any sense? Can confidence actually hinder us? In a paper I read recently entitled On Confidence, I'll link it below, there was a question. Why is it that confidence is viewed as a value? Is it in our interest to know and trust ourselves? Shouldn't we be wary of it? If we trust ourselves too much, we may take too many risks. And if we know ourselves very well, then we risk not being open to change, because we have a fixed definition of who we are and what we do, and we don't want to lose that self-knowledge. And speaking of change, self-confidence is linked to depending on yourself, which suggests we must be consistent. As I said, living with no surprises within ourselves. But we as human beings, we're not consistent. Not at all. We change. And my question is, how confident are we within about the fact that we do change? That we'll withstand the world's judgments of us, while we keep changing and contradicting ourselves throughout the years? Are we so dependent on a certain fixed conception of ourselves that any change within us will make us lose all that self-confidence we had? And do we then have to build it from scratch all over again? That sounds exhausting. So isn't it better to just stay the same? And does this mean that, like I said previously, self-confidence actually keeps us stuck? But that doesn't sound right. And I know I may be stretching it here, but I think it's important to look at the weaknesses of something that typically perceived as a strength to understand it better. There are views that confidence is a disposition, manner, habit, which suggests it's something we must learn, practice, and refresh even. So if we consider the fact that we constantly change and transform, we need to shed confidence's skin at all times to be able to be truly confident when we're faced with any sort of outer or inner change. In a sense, confidence is about both certainty and uncertainty working together. So among all those definitions and loopholes I mentioned, what is self-confidence? Is it a performance, something that helps us exist in the outside world? Or is it a habit, something we refresh in our own time, only for our own sake? As I said, confidence is about dependence, which means we must rely upon ourselves. And in that same article about confidence, I came across an interesting part in which they say, and I quote, "The term rely is related to religer, however you pronounce it. That is to say, to bind together. From this, we draw the conclusion that reliance is binding together, implying that the aspect of convention, attitude, and performance cannot be totally objectivized or depersonalized. Though confidence contains a performative act, it is not exhausted in the performance. In this sense, self-confidence, if understood as a variation of an expansion of self-reliance, is about binding together. The way I see it here, it is about taking our knowledge and our trust in ourselves, using them to adapt to our constant inner changes, and then realize them in the outside world. We can't always separate being from doing and acting. If we only act confident, we quickly detach from ourselves, of both our constants and our multitudes. But if we only feel confident inside, we may lose trust in the outside world, relying only on ourselves. And then as we go out into the world, we either remain closed onto ourselves, or we turn into a new person fully reliant on the outside world. Our internal and external realities must bind together. We can't talk about self-confidence without talking about the future. In that same article, the author mentioned anticipatory consciousness and how confidence is a variation of it. That's because confidence inevitably lives in relation to the future. Now, I made a video about the future and not relying on it too much, and I stand by that. But we still can't separate confidence from the future, since that's what we use self-confidence for. We want to know ourselves and trust ourselves to be able to step out into the world and ensure that we'll be safe and okay in the future. That in turn means that confidence always assumes a certain set of expectations, and it always involves taking a risk. As I said, we always change, and a crucial part of self-confidence is not just that we know ourselves, but that we trust ourselves enough to take a risk on ourselves. We know we'll change in the future. We know we can't anticipate everything we end up doing, but we're still confident to take that risk. Because as I said in my future video, the future versions of ourselves don't trust us. So we, in the present, must trust the future versions of ourselves instead through, that's right, self-confidence. And what about shyness? It is often used in opposition to self-confidence, especially in a certain study I read recently, in which they compared shy and self-confident people in conversations with strangers. In that study, I came across an interesting quote. It may be reasonable to assume that in order to practice the procedures which display self-confidence, one must have a large degree of trust in the predictability of everyday life. By contrast, the procedures for doing shyness may be appropriate for people who lack trust in the supportive aspect of social interaction. So here it is, trust again. But this time it is not trust in our own selves, but trust in the world, in life. Does that mean self-confidence and shyness are not that connected to each other, after all? It is one thing to trust yourself, and another one to trust the unpredictability of life and other people. But I think we can use the former to subdue the latter. And that's why self-confidence may be so important in living in the world. Because no matter how much we're caught off guard and how scared or anxious or stressed we are, we still go out into the world knowing that we will have our own back. Knowing that, 1, we know ourselves and what we want and what we need. 2, that our self-confidence is flexible enough to change as we do. And 3, to trust in ourselves enough to rely on ourselves when the outside world cannot be relied on. It's fine to be shy. It's fine to not always feel safe in the world. This can be contained. But I believe that with enough understanding and awareness of our self-confidence, we can utilize it to feel better not just within ourselves, but also in the world. And then maybe we won't even have to perform self-confidence. Maybe then it won't matter. What do you think about the discrepancy of being versus acting confident? Do you agree with my take on it, or not necessarily? Let me know in the comments how you define self-confidence. And if you are confident enough in what I create, then consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you for your time.